Welcome to the Chessmaster Academy. I'm Josh Waitzkin. I fell in love with chess when I was 6 years old, and I've spent much of my life in the sway of this beautiful, riveting art form. Over the years, I've won and lost countless national and world championship games around the globe, and I've emerged from my experience with an appreciation for the journey and a passion for learning. An amazing thing about chess is you can study it for a lifetime and still discover new mysteries every day, and yet you can also feel the essential beauty of the game in your first lessons. If you have not yet touched the mystery of chess, you're in for a treat. In this academy, I'll lay the foundation for your exploration of what I call the black and white jungle. In part 1 of the course, we'll learn the rules of chess. I'll teach you the powers and values of the pieces, and once you've internalized these basics, we'll be ready to enter the heart and soul of the game. In part 2 of the course, I'll teach the fundamentals of chess tactics, and you'll possess the building blocks to the arsenal that propelled me to the top of the scholastic chess world. Then, in part 3, we'll delve into some more subtle, strategical ideas that will be powerful on and off the chessboard. I have come to believe that the best way to approach chess is in a manner that teaches us about ourselves and about learning in general. I recommend that you keep your eyes open for the parallels between life and chess. They're out there, waiting to be discovered. Over time, you'll internalize the lessons of this academy, and the principles will become part of your intuition. Then the chessboard will become a thrilling arena for you to express yourself with creativity and freedom. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few suggestions. As you progress through this academy and beyond, please remember, growth comes at the point of resistance. This course will gradually stretch the mind, so don't get frustrated if you're stumped or forget something. I can't tell you how many chess problems have confused me until the answer dawned like a revelation. I may sometimes ask a question which feels a bit tricky. In general, the more effort you put into these challenges, the more you'll get out of the experience. The idea is not to get everything right, but to do the best you can with the knowledge you have so far, and then to soak in my explanations. If I've learned anything over the years, it's that the road to mastery is about growth, not perfection. So with that spirit, let's dive in. Welcome to the black and white jungle. Let's begin with the chessboard. There are 64 squares on the chessboard, 32 light, 32 dark. When we talk about the game, the lines that run vertically up and down the board are called files. The lines that run horizontally across the board are called ranks. And the lines that cut diagonally through the board are called diagonals. So these are your files. These are your ranks. And these are your diagonals. Now remember, when you set up a chessboard, you always want to have a light square in the lower right-hand corner of the board. And in the beginning of the game, white always goes first. But we'll get to that later. Now we're going to learn the language of chess, what's called algebraic notation. The vertical columns on the chessboard, the files, are lettered A through H. This is the A file, the B file, C, D, E, F file, G file, H file. The horizontal ranks are numbered 1 through 8. This is the first rank, second rank, third rank, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth rank. So if we're talking about this square, we line up the letter, which we see is the D, and the number 5. This is the D5 square. This is the F6 square. This square over here, line up the letter and the number, the C7 square. Why don't you try a few? Let's try a few exercises. Touch the D5 square with your cursor. You got it. Now touch the B1 square. That's right. Now touch the E7 square. No problem. Touch the H4 square. Yep, that's it. Touch the A8 square. Excellent work. Now let's get to know the chess pieces. This is the king. This is the queen, the rook, the bishop, the knight, and the pawn. Now let's learn the values of all the pieces. The pawn is the weakest piece on the chessboard. It's also known as the unit of value in chess. So the strengths of the other pieces are measured by the number of pawns that they're worth. The knight is worth around 3 pawns. The bishop is also worth around 3 pawns. We'll talk more about this later. The knight and the bishop are both worth around 3 pawns, but they move very, very differently. In some positions, knights are stronger. In other positions, bishops are stronger. And you'll learn about these nuances in a little bit. For now, knight 3 pawns, bishop 3 pawns. The rook is a powerful piece. It's worth 5 pawns. The queen is the most powerful piece on the chessboard. It's worth 9 pawns. The king doesn't really have a value that can be measured with pawns because the king, though not so powerful, cannot be lost. The aim of the game is to capture the enemy king. So your king has infinite value, although not all that much power. Now that you know all the chess pieces, let's learn how to set up the board. Remember, both sides begin with a light square in the lower right-hand corner. So let's say you're white. The rooks go in the corners. Next to them come the knights, then the bishops, and finally the queen and king. An easy way to remember what color square to put your king and queen on is that the king always begins on the opposite color of what it is. So if it's a white king, it begins on a dark square. If it's a black king, it begins on a light square. Now the pawns cover the entire second rank. You begin with 8 pawns. Remember, I said the pawn is the least valuable piece, but you have a lot of them. So here we see white's setup. The rooks are in the corners. The white king is beginning on a dark square. The queen is beginning on the same color as she is. She's a white queen beginning on a light square. Bishops and knights, and the pawns cover the entire second rank. Now for black, it's the same. The pawns cover the entire 7th rank. The rooks go in the corners. The black king begins on a light square. The black queen begins on a dark square. Remember, the king always begins on the opposite color square of what it is, and the queen begins on the same color. So the black queen begins on a dark square, the black king begins on a light square. Then come the knights and the bishops. Now it's your turn. Click on each piece and drag it to its setup position on the board. No, that's not it. Queens begin on the D file next to the king. Remember, the white queen begins on a light square. The black queen begins on a dark square. Way to go! So we've just learned the values of all the pieces and how to set them up. Now we'll learn how they move. The chess pieces might seem strange to you at first, but soon they'll feel natural, almost a part of you. Let's begin with the unit of value in chess, the pawn. Individually, pawns are the least powerful of all pieces, but there are more of them on the board than any other piece, so it's essential to learn how to use them in coordination. The game begins with each side possessing 8 pawns all lined up on the 2nd and 7th rank, as you've learned. In the beginning of the game, the primary function of the pawn is to take control of the center of the board and to protect the king. So this is how the pawn moves. On each pawn's first move, it has the option of moving ahead 1 square or 2. It's very important to remember that after its first move, pawns can only move ahead 1 square at a time. So here this e2 pawn can move to either e3 or e4, because it's that pawn's first move. But once it's on e4, it can only move to e5. The pawn possesses a number of unique qualities. First of all, the pawn is the only piece that cannot move backwards. So as we'll explore in Part 3 of the Academy, we have to be careful not to overextend our pawn structure. You'll see more about that later. Also, the pawn is the only piece that captures differently from how it moves. Pawns move straight ahead, but they capture diagonally. This is tricky. So in this position, the white d3 pawn can capture black's pawn on c4, but not the black pawn on d4. In this position, the white pawn on d3 can't move at all. It's blockaded by the black pawn on d4, and there's nothing for it to capture. Despite being small, each pawn has enormous potential. the pawn's greatest power is called promotion. Anytime a pawn successfully journeys to the end of the board, it can transform into any other chess piece on the board, except for the king, of course. A queen, rook, knight, or bishop. We almost always promote into a queen, but there are rare exceptions which I'll show you a bit later. Highlight all the legal pawn moves. You got it! In this position, what do you think white should do? Good job. White can capture the pawn and will soon promote. In this position, it's white's move. Who do you think will promote first, white or black? Good job. White's pawn can move faster because of its two-move head start. h4. Then black will play a5. White plays h5, a4, h6, a3, h7, a2, h8. White gets there faster. This exercise is a little bit trickier. It's black's move. What would you play? Good job. After black plays e5, white's position self-destructs, because the only possible pawn moves loses a pawn. After e5, white's forced to play d4, after which black can capture. There's a term for this type of position in chess, called zugzwang. What this means is that if I'm in zugzwang, any move that I make will hurt my position. I'm paralyzed, but I'm forced to move. So here you can see that come across on the board. If it's white's move, the only legal move is d3 to d4, after which black can capture the pawn. Now interestingly, if it was black's move and he played e4, the only legal move, white could capture that pawn. So in fact, this is a position of mutual zugzwang, which means whosever move it is will be in a big disadvantage. Take a look at this setup. It's a little bit more complicated. Let's say you have the black pieces. White has two options, either e3 or e4. Let's take a look at both. If I play e3, what should you do? Good job. Now my only option loses the game for me, as we saw last example. After e4, you can capture the pawn. Now let's look at this position and say that I play e4 on the first move. What would you do? That's right. Here your best move is f6, once again paralyzing me. If I play e5, which is my only option, you can capture the pawn f takes e5. So in this position we can see that if white plays e3, black's best move is f5. If white plays e4, black's best move is f6. And in both cases, white will lose a pawn because he had to move first. So in fact, if you go back, whosever move it is in this position will lose. Take some time and work that out on your own. Take a look at this position. What's white's best move? Good job. The point here is that any move that black makes will self-destruct. Black's in zugzwang. If he plays c4, d takes c4, wins a pawn. If he plays d5, e takes d5, wins the game. And if he plays g5, white can play h takes g5. Now we're going to have to learn one of the more tricky rules of chess, en passant, French for in passing. This is how it works. Let's say that a white e-pawn has advanced to the 5th rank. Effectively, this pawn is keeping an eye on the f and d pawns of black because of the following rule. If either of those pawns advances 2 squares, the white pawn has the option of capturing it diagonally, as if it only moved 1 square. So if d5, white can play e takes d6. There are 2 important stipulations to remember. First of all, this is a one-shot deal. If white chooses not to capture the pawn immediately after d5, then he'll lose the chance forever. Also, say white has a pawn on e5 and black has a pawn on d6. If black plays d6 to d5, white cannot capture en passant. This rule only applies if a pawn is moved 2 squares forward, passing an enemy pawn that is residing on its 5th rank. And don't forget that you only have one chance. Here are a couple exercises that involve en passant. So in this position, black plays d5. Show me all white's possible captures. Good job, but there's more. Keep looking. Good job, but there's more. Keep looking. Good job. Pawns captured diagonally, whether it's en passant or a normal capture. In this position, black plays b5. Show me all white's possible captures. Good job. The only capture is c takes d6. Now let's learn about the king. The king is the most valuable piece in the game, because if we lose him, it's all over. The goal in chess is to capture the enemy king while providing sufficient protection to your own king. But despite its precious nature, the king is not terribly mobile. In this position, the white king on e5 can move to all of these squares. It's easy to remember how the king moves. It can move one square in any direction, as long as that square isn't defended by an enemy piece. So here the white king can move to any of these squares. In this position, with the king on c2, the king can move to these squares. So remember, a king can move diagonally, horizontally, or vertically one square whenever it wants to. In the beginning of the game, we want to keep the king safe, protect him behind a phalanx of pawns. But later, when there is less danger lurking, we can use the king actively. With its dependable pattern of motion, the king can be a very powerful short-range warrior. It's critical to learn how to judge when the appropriate time is to activate the king. I'll develop this in the endgame section of the course. So you know how the king moves. We also know that the goal in chess is to capture the king. Whenever the king is threatened, it's called check. In this position, if white plays the pawn from e4 to e5, we know that pawns capture diagonally, the black king is in check. This is marked with a plus mark, by the way, in notation. So here this would be e5, check. The black king would have to move, and we can see that the black king could move to e6, e7, d7, c7, or c6. The black king couldn't move to c5 or d5, or capture on e5 because the white king defends those squares. It's an illegal move for a king to ever move to a square where it can be captured. This is called check. So when you're in check, you can just move out of the way. The real goal in chess is checkmate. In this position, white can play e7, which is checkmate. The black king is attacked, but it can't move anywhere. The c8 and e8 squares are defended by the white d7 pawn. The e7 pawn of white attacks the black king, and the white king defends that pawn, defends the d7 pawn, and also guards the c7 square. Black can't go anywhere. This is called checkmate. This is your goal in chess. There's one more way for the game to end. In this position, it's white's move. What can he do? Well, any answer you gave would have to be wrong because there's no square you can move to. c1 and e1 are guarded by the black d2 pawn. e2, d2, and c2 are guarded by the black king. So in fact, white can't move anywhere, but white's not in check. This is called stalemate. The game is drawn. So we know if we attack the king, it's check. The king can move away. If we attack the king and the king can't go anywhere, that's checkmate. The game is over and the player who delivered the checkmate wins. Stalemate is when you cannot make any legal moves with your king, but you're not in check. The game is drawn. Now let's do some exercises to get used to king moves. Here, touch all the squares the white king can move to. That's right. Remember, the king can never move into a position where it can be captured. In this exercise, white's in check. What do you think the best move is? Good job. The white king can capture the d4 pawn. Of course, taking the f5 pawn is bad, because it puts the king in danger. Here the white king is in check. What is white's only legal move? Good job. The only unprotected square is f4. Here white is in check. What's the best move? Good job. It turns out the white can get out of check and checkmate with the same move. By capturing the black pawn with your pawn, you've placed the black king in checkmate. In this position, it's white's move. I'd like you to take a moment and think it out. Stalemate is the theme here. White to play. Good job. By moving your king to e6, you force the black king to move to c7, and you can now play king e7, followed by promoting your pawn on d8. Black will eventually lose. The rook is a very powerful piece, worth 5 pawns. In this position, the rook on e5 can touch any of these squares. The rook can move as far as it wants to, horizontally or vertically, until a piece stands in its way. So, in this position, this rook can move to any of these squares. Now, if there were a pawn, say, on c6, the rook could only move to these squares, and it would also have the option of capturing the black pawn on c6. Rook on c3 takes c6. The rook is an excellent long-distance operator. We want him on open lines because he can't jump over other pieces. On an empty board, the rook controls the same number of squares whether placed in the center or the side of the board. As we'll see later, this is very unusual. Most chess pieces are much more powerful when centrally placed. Let's practice moving the rook around. In this exercise, move the rook to the b1 square. You got it. Here, take 2 moves to move the white rook to the g7 square. That's right. What's the next move? You got it. In this position, can the black rook capture a white pawn? That's right. As you know, the king is the most important piece in your chess army. Protecting your king from attack is how you keep from losing the game. Because it's so important, there's a special move called castling, which you can use to put your king in a safe place. Castling is the only time in chess in which you're allowed to move 2 of your pieces, a king and a rook, in one move. Here's a board set up with only the white king and the 2 white rooks. You can castle either to the king side, which is called castling short, or to the queen side, which is referred to as castling long. In this exercise, we'll castle kingside. First, move the king 2 spaces towards the rook, to g1. Then move the rook to the other side of the king, on f1. Good work. In this exercise, we'll castle queenside. Move the king 2 spaces towards the rook, to c1, and move the rook to the other side of the king, to d1. Excellent work. In a game, castling moves the king away from the center of the board where it's more vulnerable to attack. Note how much safer the 2 kings are after they castle. Here, white castles queenside, and black castles kingside. It's usually a good idea to castle early in a game, both to protect the king and give the rook a chance to control the center files. There are 4 important rules that govern castling. Rule number 1. The king and rook may not have moved from their starting squares. In this board setup, white cannot castle to either side because both rooks have moved from their starting positions. Even if one of the rooks moves back, white still cannot castle. Rule number 2. All of the spaces between the rook and the king must be unoccupied. In this diagram, white cannot castle kingside because the knight is in the way. But he can castle queenside because all of the spaces between the king and the rook are empty. Rule number 3. The king cannot be in check. In this position, it would appear that white can castle kingside because neither the king nor the rook has moved from its starting square, and the spaces between the rook and the king are empty. However, the white king is currently in check from the black pawn on d2, so he cannot castle. Rule number 4. The squares that the king passes over cannot be under attack, and since you can never move your king into check, the square to which it's moving can't be under attack either. In this position, the spaces between the king and the rook on the queen side are open. However, the d1 square is guarded by the black rook on d8, so the white king cannot pass over it. Castling is illegal. In this position, the c1 square is guarded by the black rook on c8, so the king can't land on it. Castling is illegal here as well. Now that you know how the rook moves, let's take a look at a few checkmates. In this position, white can actually checkmate the black king in one move. Do you see it? Yep, that's it. The black king is trapped on the back rank, the white king guards the d7, e7, and f7 squares, and the white rook mates the king. This is called a back rank mate. Here's another variation of the back rank mate. White to move. Do you see it? Yep, that's it. Rook a8, once again, is checkmate. And here the white king doesn't need to help out, because the pawns on f7, g7, and h7 are trapping the black king. Notice how our own pieces can hurt us. This is once again called a back rank mate. In this position, there are a lot of pieces on the board, but if we're familiar with the back rank mate, we should be able to spot it here. Black to move. What do you see? Good job. The correct move is Rook a1, checkmate, a back rank mate. It's important to learn the patterns on an empty board so we can have the tools to navigate the complexities of chess. I call this exercise Monster Rook. Here, calculate how the white rook can take all the black pieces in sequence, without any breaks. No problem. White to move, mate in 1. Good job. Your rook on h6 covers the 6th rank, while your king covers the b4 and b5 squares. By moving your rook to a2, you've checkmated the black king. White to move, mate in 1. That's right, rook takes a4, checkmate. Here it's white to move and mate in 1. What's the best move? That's it. By moving your rook to h8, you've checkmated the black king, and there's no way to block. In this position, it's mate in 2 moves. What is black's first move? Good job. Now it's mate in 1 move. What is the last move? You got it. By using both of your rooks in this manner, you're forcing the white king into a smaller and smaller area, until finally he's trapped and can't escape. This one's tricky. Take your time, remember everything you've learned so far, and try to find white's best move. You may see that you can take one of black's rooks with rook takes h5, but that would be a huge mistake. Why? What is black's best move? That's right. If you take on h5, black has rook e1 back rank mate. The tables are turned. So now let's go back to the original position. What should white do? Find the strongest sequence of moves. Good job. Now it's mate in 2 moves. What's next? You got it. Now it's mate in 1 move. What's the last one? Excellent work. You found mate in 3. Congratulations. In this position, it's white to move and mate in 2. This problem combines pawn and rook moves, using a number of patterns you've already seen. White to play. What do you see? Good job. Checking the black king. Your rook is cutting me off from going backwards, so after king h4, what's mate in 1 here? Rook h6. Excellent work. A back rank mate on the side of the board. Take a look at this position. What's white's best move? That's right. Here we can use the tactical device called a skewer to win the black rook. Rook d3 check skewers the black king to the rook. After king e4, rook takes d8, and white has won a rook. So rook takes g3 was possible, winning a pawn, but the best move was rook d3. A skewer is when you have 2 enemy pieces lined up on the same diagonal, rank, or file. You attack the stronger piece. It has to move out of the way, and that opens up an X-ray attack onto the weaker piece. Excellent long-distance operators like the rook, bishop, or queen are very good for these types of operations. Now we're ready to learn about a quirky long-distance operator, the bishop. Bishops can move as far as their path is unblocked, along the diagonal. So in this position, the bishop can move to any of these squares. The major drawback of a bishop is that it can only touch the squares and the color on which it travels. So a bishop that begins on dark squares can only touch the 32 dark squares on the chessboard. Of course, a bishop that begins on a light square can only touch the 32 light squares on the chessboard. So we call our bishops a dark squared bishop or a light squared bishop. So while a bishop can go very far with one move, it's relegated to only half the squares in the chessboard. This is why the bishop is worth only 3 pawns. In this type of position, the bishop can slice right through white's pawn structure, but it can never attack any of the white pawns because they're all in dark squares. So here you can see both the pros and the cons of a light squared bishop. Like every other piece except for the pawn, the bishop captures the way it moves. It cannot jump over other pieces. And if a bishop is blocked in by its own pawns, it's considered a bad bishop. You always want to maximize the mobility of your chess pieces. Here, the white bishop is blocked in by its own pawns and can't do anything active. The black bishop, on the other hand, is free to roam and can attack the white pawns on dark squares. In this position, black is winning because he has the better bishop. Now let's take a moment to talk about quality in chess. We say that each piece has a numerical value. Bishops are worth 3 pawns. Rooks are worth 5 pawns. But in fact, the values of pieces fluctuate with the board position, and it's important to learn about the principles which determine what makes a given kind of piece more or less powerful. It turns out, for instance, that bishops are much better in open games than in closed games. An open game, by the way, is when the central pawn structure is not blocked. In this position, the pawns are wide open, so the bishop can cut through the whole position. Here, on the other hand, the bishops are locked in by the pawns. Knights, on the other hand, while they're also worth roughly 3 pawns, are better in closed games. We'll learn about the knights soon, but for now just remember that knights are the only piece that can jump over other pieces. So in a closed game, a knight can leap into attack, while other pieces are locked in. So if you have a bishop against a knight, you want to open up the game. With knowledge of these principles, as they'll be taught in this course, you'll be able to make long-term strategic decisions, even in your first weeks of play. Just to show you the power of centralization in chess, and also to show you the power of the bishop, take a look at this position. Here white's 2 bishops, on d5 and e5, cover all of these squares. But of course notice that the white bishop alone only covers these, and the black bishop covers the rest. So, the power of 2 bishops is very important to understand. In chess, we refer to one side or another as having 2 bishops. So while a bishop is worth 3 pawns and a knight is worth 3 pawns, usually 2 bishops together are better than a bishop and a knight, because they complete each other. Let's try out some exercises. This we call monster bishop. Black to move and take all the white pieces consecutively, capturing 1 piece per move. Good job! You found the right sequence to capture all the white pieces. Take a look at this position. First, click on all the black pieces that the white bishop can capture. Good. Now, what is white's best move? Excellent work. Bishop d4 is checkmate and ends the game right away. Here white has 2 bishops for a rook. What is white's best move? I'm sure you see that the black rook is attacking the h2 bishop. Bishop f4, very good. King b1. What's the next move? Bishop e4 check, excellent work, driving the king all the way to the corner of the board. King a1. What's mate in 1 here? Excellent work. Bishop e5 checkmate. A critical pattern, similar to the way you used 2 rooks earlier to trap a king. Here you've used your 2 bishops in the same manner. It's white to move here. What's the best move? The first thing you should do is notice all of the black pieces that can be captured. Why don't you highlight them? Good job. Now which is the most valuable piece that can be taken? White had 3 options and you found the best move. Way to go. In this position, look for all your moves. White to play. What do you see? Remember, bishops can cover a lot of distance. Do you see mate in 1? Rook h8 mate. Great work. The rook is supported by the bishop on the opposite corner of the board. Here it's white's move, but be careful to find the best move. What do you see? Excellent work. Rook b6 mate combines the rook and the bishop to win the game. Sometimes when we're closest to victory, we release the tension of the game and throw everything away. Notice how terrible a mistake rook takes f5 would have been. Here black is stalemated. There are no legal moves. Once again in this position, you want to find the best move. White to play. Good job. Force the black king to move out of danger and win a rook for free. What is white's best move? This one is tricky and it introduces a new idea, a tactic called the fork. Good job. Bishop takes c5 check wins a pawn and a rook because it forks the king and the rook. A fork, of course, is like a fork in the road. We'll discuss this tactical idea later on, but it's when one piece attacks two enemy pieces at once. Bishop takes c5 check is very strong. Don't worry if you had trouble with this one. This was the first time forks were discussed, and you'll be learning more about these in the upcoming exercises. I just wanted to show you the idea. Now for the queen. She's the most powerful piece on the chessboard. The queen combines the powers of the rook and the bishop, and is worth 9 pawns. Or 2 bishops and a knight, 2 knights and a bishop, a rook, bishop, and pawn, or any other combination of pieces. Of course, these valuations vary with the position, and we have to learn how to make the judgments. So as I mentioned, the queen combines the powers of the rook and the bishop, so she can move as far as she is unblocked, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. So this queen on the central square controls all of these squares. A really powerful piece. Here, mark all the black pieces that can be captured by the queen. Good job. And now capture the most valuable piece. Good job. The rook on g7 was the most valuable piece to be captured. Here, find mate in 1. Way to go! Queen b2 is checkmate. Here, white has mate in 1. Do you see it? Good job. Queen d6 is checkmate. The white pawn on c5 guards the d6 square, and the black king has nowhere to go. Do you see mate in 1 here? White to move. Good job. Queen g7 is checkmate. What is white's best move? Good job. Queen d5 check wins the rook with a fork. In this position, white has mate in 1. Do you see it? This is a little tricky. Take a moment. Excellent work. The only way to checkmate is to promote your pawn. a8 queen. Checkmate. Here white has mate in 1 again, but this one's very tricky. Take your time. Good work. The right move is king g6 checkmate, a discovered attack. A discovered attack is when you can move one piece, opening up the attack of another piece. In this position, the white queen on b3 is blocked in its attack on the black king on g8 by a white rook on d5. When that white rook moves, it's a discovered attack. The white queen will have discovered check onto the black king. Notice, of course, that if white plays either rook d8 check or rook g5 check, the king is attacked 2 ways. This is called a double check. Very powerful. In part 2 of the course, when we build you a tactical arsenal, we'll spend more time with discoveries. For now, I just want you to be familiar with the term. Here's another example of a discovered attack. The white pawn can move from d5 to d6, opening up a discovered check on the black king from the bishop on g2. There are countless forms of discovery, and we'll look at more later on. What is white's best move? Find the best discovery. Good job. Rook d5 check wins the black queen. The white rook moves out of the way, opening up an attack of the white queen on a1 onto the black king on g7, and attacks the black queen. Notice that rook takes b4, another option, would have been a mistake. It also attacks the black queen, and checks, but here black can block, queen to e5, protected by the pawn on d6. Black gets out of check and gets the queen out of the way. Now we're up to a unique piece, the knight. The knight is the only chess piece that can jump over other pieces, but it can't go very far in one leap. It moves in an L pattern, 2 squares in one direction and 1 square in another, or step, step, side, as my mother puts it. So if the knight is here on d5, it can move to these squares, step, step, side, or step, step, side. It's also interesting to note that the knight always moves from a light square to a dark square, or vice versa. Because of its counterintuitive style, sometimes the knight can be confusing. So let's look at a graphic that might help you out. In this graphic, you can see how many moves it takes the knight to reach each square. If you click on that square, Chessmaster will play out the knight's path to reach it. By watching these movements, you'll start to become familiar with the flow of the knight. In this graphic, you can see how many moves it takes the knight to reach each square. If you click on that square, Chessmaster will play out the knight's path to reach it. By watching these movements, you'll start to become familiar with the flow of the knight. In this graphic, you can see how many moves it takes the knight to reach each square. If you click on that square, Chessmaster will play out the knight's path to reach it. By watching these movements, you'll start to become familiar with the flow of the knight. In this graphic, you can see how many moves it takes the knight to reach each square. If you click on that square, Chessmaster will play out the knight's path to reach it. By watching these movements, you'll start to become familiar with the flow of the knight. One thing you should notice is that the knight on d5 takes 4 moves to get to b7 or f7. Diagonally with 1 square in between is very far for a knight, so you can be very close to a knight, but safe from attack. A knight is very good in a closed game because it can jump over other pieces. We also want to find outposts for the knight. An outpost is a square deep in the enemy camp that an enemy pawn cannot attack. Click on all the squares defended by the knight. The knight can cover 8 squares when placed in the center of the board. Good job. It's very important to notice how powerful the knight is in the middle of the board. The center is a theme we'll keep on coming back to throughout this academy. Now in this position, touch all the squares the knight attacks. Good job. The knight can cover 4 squares on the side of the board. Of course, you remember the knight's touched 8 squares when in the center of the board. Now in this position, click on all the squares defended by the knight. Exactly. The knight can only cover 2 squares from the corner of the board. So, the knight in the corner covers 2 squares. The knight in the side covers 4 squares. The knight in the center covers 8 squares. We always want to centralize our knight, and this holds true with most of the chess pieces. Centralized pieces can go right, they can go left, they can go up, they can go down. They can go everywhere. With the knights, my first teacher used to always tell me, a knight on the rim is grim. It's a good way to remember to centralize your knights. This exercise will be good for training visualization. How many moves will it take the knight to get to g6? That's right. In this position, how many moves will it take the knight to get to b1? Good job. How long will it take the knight to reach the g3 square? Good job. How many moves will it take for the knight to reach a8? Excellent work. The most common weapon of a knight is the fork. Do you see how the white knight can attack all of black's pieces if moved to the appropriate square? Good work. Knight c7 check. You can attack all of the black pieces. What is black's best move? Here we see that black has 2 possible forks. Play the best one. Good job. Knight b4 check wins the queen. When deciding between two possible forks, always go for the most valuable pieces. In this position, you can combine the bishop and knight to mate in two. That's right. Knight h6 check forces the black king to take refuge on h8 because the white bishop guards the f8 square. Now you have mate in 1. Do you see it? Bishop c3 checkmate. The knight on h6 guards the g8 square, the white king guards h7, and the bishop on c3 delivers the final blow. So here you can see that white uses the bishop, the knight, and the king to corral the black king. Coordinating your pieces in this way is central to attacking chess. Remember the theme of discovered attacks. Anywhere the white knight moves will open up a discovered check from the white queen on c3. Knights are very good for discoveries. What's your best move? Good job. The key idea is to move the knight to a square that sets up a support mate. After knight h5 check, the black king has to move, either to g8 or h7. In either case, there's mate in 1 for white. Do you see it? Now mate in 1. Queen g7 checkmate. The knight on h5 guards the g7 square, and the queen finishes the game. So here you see queen and knight coordinating together. As a general rule, queen and knight is usually a little stronger than queen and bishop, because the bishop and queen are a little bit redundant, while the queen combines with the unique powers of the knight to be a devastating attacking force. Congratulations! You finished the lessons of Part 1. Now we're up to the Mastery Quiz. But first, if you don't feel completely comfortable with all the pieces, then I suggest you go back and repeat whatever lessons or exercises you feel necessary. The movements of the chess pieces need to be in your fingers in order to flow with the ideas we're about to discuss in the Mastery Quiz. Before you start, I just want to say something. The questions in this Mastery Quiz may be a little bit harder than the ones you've seen so far, so don't move until you see it, and good luck. In this position, it's black's move. I want you to think about it. Obviously, a pawn race is central to this issue. Black's pawn wants to shoot down to the a1 square, and white's pawn wants the queen on h8. You can decide whether you want to be white or black. So, the first step of this problem is to click on the white or black key, and then you'll play out the solution to the problem. Take your time, don't move until you see it. Who'd you like to play? White or black? Remember, it's black's move. Good job. Okay, you've chosen to be black. Do you recognize this position? This is from the final game of the film Searching for Bobby Fischer. I had the black pieces in the film, and my opponent thought he was winning in the pawn race. In fact, white does queen first, but maybe black is winning. Let's play it out. What is your move? Good job. I play h5. Now what do you do? That's a good move, but it looks like I'm going to queen first. What's the next move? Now what are you going to do? I already have a queen. You don't. Yep, that's it. White queens first, but in fact black is winning, because you queen with check and then win the white queen. The white king is skewered, and after it moves, queen takes h8, black wins the game. Here white has mate in 2. It's your move. Good move. Cutting off the black king. My only legal move is king c8. It's your move. Way to go! Rook e8, a back rank mate. Here white has mate in 4. What's the first move? Rook b5 check. Good work. I play king g6. Rook a6 check. Excellent work. This is the pattern we saw earlier. Some people call this stair-stepping. I play king f7. Rook b7 check. And now after king e8, mate in 1. Rook a8 checkmate. Excellent work. Here white has mate in 5, but this one is a little tricky. Take your time. Recreate the pattern we found before. Excellent work. The correct answer is to switch sides. Rook b4, a quiet move. Now you cut off the black king from escaping towards the first rank. King f5 is played. What now? Good work. Rook a5 check. Now you begin the stair-stepping routine all over again. King e6. Very good. Rook b6 check. King f7. Now what? Rook a7 check. Good work. And now after I move, Excellent work. Rook b8. Checkmate. Here black has mate in 2. Take your time. Try to find it. Good move. With h4, black puts white into zugzwang. The only possible legal move is king to f1, because the rook cuts off the king along the d-file. And after king f1, what do? Rook d1 checkmate. Excellent work. So the h4 move, in a sense, was wasting time. Black had nothing immediate he could do. But after h4, white self-destructs. Remember, zugzwang means that any move you make will hurt your position. Notice that the black rook couldn't move anywhere else along the d-file, because white's pawns cover all the squares. And if black were to move rook a8, for example, then white could escape to d2 and leave the back rank. So h4 was the only way to mate in 2, utilizing the theme of zugzwang. Here it's white to move and mate in 2. Don't move until you see it. King c2 discovered check. Black has to play king c4. That's the only move. Now mate in 1. Rook d4 mate. Good job. So notice that here in the endgame, the white king plays a critical role in attacking. This is something which we're going to see later on in the Chessmaster courses. In the beginning of the game we want to defend our king, but later on the king can become a very powerful attacking piece. Here the king on c2 both guards the c3 pawn and takes away the b3 square from the black king. The white king is critical in mating the black king. This is a monster knight. Only the white knight can move, and he must capture all the black pieces without a break. Calculate everything out from the beginning so you don't make a mistake. What's the correct sequence? No, that's not quite it. Well done. That was quite a calculation. Really great work. Here's another monster knight. Remember, calculate everything out from the beginning so you don't make a mistake. Find the right pattern. No, that's not quite it. No, that's not quite it. Great job. That problem required some serious visualization. Another monster knight. Again, only the white knight can move and he must capture all the black pieces without a break. You know what to do. No, that's not quite it. 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 Well done. You're really getting good at this. Here it's white to move and win the black knight. Take your time. This is a little tricky. That's right. Bishop d5. The black knight is trapped. Anywhere it goes to, the white bishop can capture it. What's your next move? That's right. Bishop a5 or bishop g5 attacks the knight is pinned down to the square by the bishop on d5, and white wins the knight. This relationship between bishop and knight, when there are two squares between them, is very important. In this way, bishops can completely dominate knights. Here it's white to move. Now I know this position looks pretty confusing because there's a lot going on, but don't worry about it. Take your time, notice all the lines. White to move. What's best? Excellent work. But turns out white has checkmate in one move. Knight c3. The white rook on f8, bishop on h8, bishop on g4, knight on c3, and king on d2 all combine to corral the black king right in the center of the board. So if you return to this initial position, we see that the black king is stuck in the center of the board. We see that the white rook is cutting along the f-file, the white bishop, the white rook on h1 is very strong, but there's no way for it to attack because rook e1 check is guarded by the pawn on f2. Here you can see that white is in big trouble. The black queen on a5 has a discovered attack which is waiting to happen. The pawns on f2 and g2 are on the verge of queening. We know right away that white has to act fast, so that should be your first hint in this type of position. It's very easy to get caught up in the meaningless confusions when playing chess, or dealing with any life issue for that matter, and the key is to know where to look. When confronted by a tactical position, we should always look for forcing continuations, for example checks or captures. So here you want to look for all the checks that are possible. Knight c3 check was a check that also happens to be mate. The idea of this course is to learn the principles which will help you decipher and glide through complicated situations. In this final phase of the mastery quiz, you'll learn how to checkmate with king and queen against king, and then you'll try out your new skill. Then I'll teach you a slightly harder technique, mating with rook and king against king. Once you pass these tests, you'll have graduated to the next phase of the academy. These final two exercises will focus on the principles of corralling the enemy king. You can't just run straight at him. Slowly, patiently, you have to force the enemy against a wall before closing in for the final blow. This is a slightly more sophisticated way of thinking about chess, but you're ready for the challenge. Here we go. Let's begin from this position. The idea for white is to force the black king into the side or corner of the board. The white queen can't mate alone though. The king and queen have to coordinate together. So the first step is to start pushing the black king back. Queen d4 is an excellent centralizing move. Notice now the black king is stuck in this box. The d-file and fourth rank are closed off, so he has to stay over here. Let's say black plays king f5. Now white should bring the king into the game. King g2. He plays king e6. Black will do anything he can to stay away from the side of the board. Now I can bring the king into the game again. King f3. King activity is a critical theme in the endgame. You'll see this over and over. Let's say black plays king f5. Here white can push the black king further back. Let's say you play queen d5 check. You see now the white king guards the f4 and g4 squares. Black has to go backwards. Say king f6. Now what you do is bring the king into the game once more. King f4. Black has to make a decision. He plays king g6. Now white can move the queen. Play queen e6 check. Now black, you see, is pushed closer and closer towards one side or another of the board. If black plays king h5, then white has a number of options, one of which is the quiet move, for example, queen d6. You see the queen cuts off the 6th rank, and then after king h4, there's checkmate with queen h6 mate. If black plays king back to g7, then the white king can come further into the game, king g5. We're pushing the black king back. Let's say black plays king h7 here. Here's a tricky one. If white plays queen f7 check, forcing the black king into the corner after king h8, because notice the white king guards the h6 square, after king h8 you might want to bring the king into the game, but that would be a terrible mistake. After king g6 or king h6, the black king is stalemated. Don't fall into this trick. So queen f7 actually wasn't the best move, but if you played it, it's no problem. Now you can just bring the queen back to e7, waste a move. Black plays king g8, and now white has mate in 2, king g6, king h8, and now there's tons of mates. Queen d8 is a back rank mate, queen e8, queen f8 are also checkmate, or you can play queen g7 mate, or queen h7 mate. So you see how white did this. Again, we began in this type of position. No matter where the black king is, white's pattern will be to slowly but surely push the king to the edge of the board. Then the king and the queen combine. Remember, the basic themes you want to keep in mind. First of all, prevent the king from escaping. Remember, after queen d4, the black king, like in this position, is in a box. Then the king runs away towards the side of the board because he has nowhere else to go. Then you bring the king into the game. King activity is a critical theme in all endgames, especially when you're forcing mate, with king and queen or king and rook against king. Then you want to slowly but surely prevent the black king from escaping wherever he tries to run to, force the king to the side of the board, and at the very end there'll be moments where you can fall into stalemate traps. Don't do that. Often in chess, when you're closest to winning, you can throw the game away. That's the key to mating with king and queen against king. Now you try. Congratulations. So you see how white did this. Again, we began. Congratulations. You passed the first test. You know how to mate with king and queen against king. Now this one's going to be a little bit harder. Now you're going to mate with king and rook against king. The idea is the same, but of course you have a much less powerful piece to work with. First of all, we want to cut off the white king. I'm going to show you the most principled way of doing this. Sometimes there are slightly faster ways to checkmate, but the ideas I'm going to show you are what I want you to focus on and internalize. So first of all, because the black king is down here, we're making the decision that we're going to push the white king away from us, down the board. So black's first move is rook a4, cutting off the king from coming this way. White plays king d5. Now you have to bring the king into the game. King g2. White plays king c5. And you bring the king into the game. King f3. Now white wants to stay in the center of the board. He plays king d5. And now black plays king e3. The key relationship will be seen now. If white plays king e5, now the kings are lined up. If black checks the king is forced to move backwards. Now there are two basic techniques you could learn here. One of which is to play the move rook d4. This way you're keeping the king in this box like you did with the queen. And you can slowly but surely make that box smaller and smaller. That's actually the fastest way to do it. But I'm going to show you something else just so you can learn the idea. After you play rook check, say the white king goes back, king d6. And now you bring your king up, king d4. Now the king moves to c6. We've reached a critical position here. Again, there are two ways to go about it. One of which is to play the move rook d5. Now you see the white king is again in a very small box. He has to slowly move towards the edge of the board. The other way to go about it is to move the rook further. You could play the move rook to h5. This may not make sense right away, and I'm going to show you why. Remember, the thing we want to keep on creating is a position where, say, the white and black king are lined up like this. The king guards all of these three squares by which the white king could escape. Then the rook can leave that rank and check, and the king has to go further back. So if we're in this position, let's say you play king c4, then white could go back to where he just came from, king d6. Then black could play king d4, white can play king c6. Black hasn't made any progress. The key to the quiet move, rook h5, is that now it's white's turn. This is using the theme again of Zugzwang, forcing white to self-destruct a little bit. If white plays king b6, then black can play king c4. Eventually, white's going to have to run the other way, say king c6, and now the kings are lined up. Black can play rook h6 check, and the king is forced back one more rank. Say king d7. Then you play the move king d5. Now the white king can run either left or right. Notice, of course, that if the king moves back, say to c8, then black's next move is going to be to play rook h7, again forcing the king to be trapped on the back rank. Instead, white will either play king e7 or king c7. He wants to stay off the back rank as long as possible. If he plays king c7, remember before if you play king c5 here, the king will just run back the other way? So here we need a quiet move. The move rook g6 works, just wasting a move. Because now if white goes king d7, then rook g7 check will force the king back one more rank. Instead, white will play king b7. Now you can play king c5. Now if white plays king c7, you have the option of playing rook g7 check, forcing the white king back again. So instead, let's say white plays king a7. As you can see here, you have the option now of playing king b5. Now the white king is finally forced to play king b7, and you can play rook g7 check, forcing the king back one more rank. But then the point is that after king c8, the white king can try to run all the way down here. This will take a few moves. Black has another option. At this point, we can switch our attack. Instead of trying to force him against the back rank, we can hold him against the side of the board. You can play the move rook to b6. Now the white king is completely confined. King a8, and you can bring the king into the game. King c6. The only legal move is king a7. And now we know what we're aiming for, a position like this. So in this position, you can waste a move. Rook goes back to b1, or b2, or b3, or b4. No difference really. If white plays king a6, checkmate. If white plays king a8, then king c7. The only legal move for white is king a7, and then rook a1 is checkmate. So again, let's think about the themes we just discussed. First of all, we cut off the white king, forcing him to stay on one side of the board. Then we brought the king into the game. Then we had options. In positions like this, we can either waste a move and ultimately force the king back one more rank, or we could play, for example here, rook e4. You see what this does? This forces the king into a corner of the board. It's a different technique. Say the king goes to f6, then you can bring your king up into the game. Now the king moves to g6. Now you can play rook e6 check. The king moves back, say to f7. If the king goes to h5, remember this idea, wasting a move, you play rook a6, the king's only legal move is king h4, rook h6 is checkmate. So instead white plays king f7, and now black brings the king into the game. King f5, king g7. Now is another one of those moments where you can play with one of the two techniques. You can either play a quiet move with rook a6, or you can play the move rook f6, trapping the white king into playing in this tiny little corner of the board. Let's say you play king h7, then rook g6. Now the king is only confined to these two squares. White plays king h8, and now the black king comes into the game. King f6, king h7, king f7, king h8, mate in 1, rook h6, checkmate. So here you see how to mate with a rook and king against king. The ideas are what I want you to remember here, not memorizing moves. I showed you two different basic techniques which are related. Remember, sometimes you can waste a move to help your position. You want to slowly confine the king to moving closer and closer to the side or corner of the board, cutting off its escape routes as you go on. It takes patience, methodical thought, but now you're ready to do it. Let's test you out.